The call came in the dead of night. I had just settled into bed. The muted sounds of the city outside my window, a familiar comfort after another long shift in the emergency psychiatric unit. My hand reached instinctively for the comm device on my nightstand, my mind still groggy with the remnants of sleep. "Dr. Sullivan?" I answered. The voice on the other end was crisp and unyielding, military. "Dr. Sullivan, you're being reassigned. Effective immediately." I sat up, the fog of sleep dissipating rapidly. "Reassigned? Where to?" "The Starlight Asylum. You'll receive further instructions upon arrival. Transport leaves in an hour." The line went dead before I could protest. Starlight Asylum. I'd heard whispers of the place, a psychiatric facility orbiting a dying star, far removed from the reaches of civilized space. It was where they sent the hopeless cases, the ones no one wanted to remember, the ones that didn't fit anywhere else. I packed quickly, my movements mechanical. I left behind the life I had known, a life filled with the routine chaos of an urban hospital. There was no time to inform anyone, no time for goodbyes. The transition from the vibrant cityscape to the stark, cold expanse of space was jarring. The asylum loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the dying star, its light barely penetrating the void. The station was a relic of an older era, its metal skin pocked and scarred from decades of exposure to cosmic particles. As we docked, the artificial gravity engaged with a jolt. A guard met me at the airlock, his expression unreadable beneath the visor of his helmet. "Dr. Sullivan, welcome to Starlight Asylum." He led me through the corridors. We passed sealed doors, the numbers imprinted upon their surfaces a grim tally of the lost and forgotten souls within. My quarters were sparse, nothing like the cluttered comfort of my old apartment. A bed, a desk, a terminal, the essentials. I set down my bag and stared at the blank walls, a sense of isolation settling over me. This place was a repository for the damned. The next morning, I was summoned to the administrative office for a debriefing. The room was as austere as the rest of the facility, dominated by a large metal desk and a single overhead light. Behind the desk sat Dr. Miriam Hatcher, the head of the facility. Her sharp eyes appraised me as I entered, and she gestured for me to sit. "Dr. Sullivan," she began without preamble, "I trust your journey was uneventful?" "Yes, ma'am," I replied, though I must admit I wasn't expecting such a sudden reassignment. Dr. Hatcher's lips curled into a semblance of a smile. "Few do. Starlight Asylum operates under unique circumstances. We deal with cases that defy conventional treatment methods. Your record indicates a certain resilience that we believe will be beneficial here." Her words were clinical, detached, as if discussing a new piece of equipment rather than a human being. I nodded, choosing my words carefully. "I'm here to help, in any way I can." "Good," she said, pushing a stack of files toward me. "These are your initial cases. You'll find that our patients require a different approach. We prioritize observation over intervention, at least initially. You'll have access to all previous records, but I urge you to form your own assessments." I leafed through the files. The patients' histories were filled with strange incidents, unexplained behaviors, and treatments that had only made things worse. Dr. Hatcher watched me closely, her eyes glinting with an unspoken challenge. "One more thing, Dr. Sullivan," she said, her tone softer but no less serious. "The asylum's true nature is not for everyone. Some find it overwhelming. If at any point you feel compromised, report to me immediately. Do you understand?" I met her gaze, the weight of her words sinking in. "Yes, I understand." The rest of the day passed in a rush of introductions and orientations. I met the other staff members, a small but dedicated team of doctors, nurses, and security personnel. Each had their own air of quiet resignation, as if they had long accepted the peculiarities of this place. The next morning, I got into my usual uniform, its stiff material making me feel the weight of my new situation. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a tired face staring back at me. Those dark circles under my eyes telling the tale of a sleepless night. I made my way to the main office, the halls eerily quiet. Dr. Hatcher was already there, waiting for me. Her presence was as cold and clinical as the surroundings. "Good morning, Dr. Sullivan. I trust you found your quarters adequate." "Yes, thank you," I replied, trying to match her detached professionalism. "Today you'll be meeting with some of our senior staff," she continued. "They will brief you on the specific cases you'll be handling. Follow me." We walked in silence, her brisk pace forcing me to keep up. The place was like a maze with all those same-looking hallways and locked doors everywhere. The briefing room was small, dominated by a long metal table. 3 people were already seated, their expressions varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion. Dr. Hatcher introduced them in quick succession. Dr. Andrew Keller, head of neuropsychiatry, nurse specialist Amanda Hall, and security chief Mason Trent. Keller was a tall, thin man with a gaunt face and piercing blue eyes. He gave a curt nod, his gaze lingering on me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Hall was a stern-looking woman, her features sharp and her eyes hard. Trent, on the other hand, was a mountain of a man, his presence imposing. "Dr. Sullivan," Keller began, his voice smooth but with an underlying edge. "Welcome to our little corner of the universe. I'm sure you've already heard some rumors about this place. Let me assure you, reality is far stranger." I took a seat, trying to appear composed. "I'm here to do my job, whatever that entails." "Good," Keller replied, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You'll find that the patients here are unique. Standard treatments don't apply. You'll need to think outside the box." Hall leaned forward, her eyes boring into mine. "And you'll need to be strong, mentally and physically. This place has a way of getting under your skin." Trent grunted in agreement. "Security protocols are strict for a reason. Follow them, and you might just survive." Dr. Hatcher handed me a tablet, the screen displaying a list of patient names and their respective conditions. "These are your primary cases. Review them carefully. You'll start rounds tomorrow." As the meeting adjourned, Keller stayed behind, his gaze fixed on me. "A word of advice, Dr. Sullivan," he said, his voice low. "Don't trust everything you see. This place has secrets, and not all of them are meant to be uncovered." I left the room feeling unsettled. Keller's warning stuck with me, a bad feeling about what was to come. I spent the rest of the day in my quarters, reviewing patient files and trying to piece together the fragments of their tortured lives. One file in particular caught my attention. Subject 0237, Emily Cross, the same name I had seen the previous night. Her records were a jumbled mess of conflicting reports and bizarre incidents. She spoke of shadows that whispered secrets, of eyes watching from the darkness. Each attempt at treatment seemed to drive her further into madness. The descriptions were disturbingly vivid, painting a picture of a mind unraveling in the face of something incomprehensible. The more I read, the more I felt a strange kinship with her. Was I, too, on the brink of losing my grip on reality? That night, sleep eluded me. The silence of the asylum weighed on my mind. I could hear faint sounds, distant and indistinct, like the murmurs of 1,000 voices just beyond the edge of hearing. I lay in the darkness, my thoughts a chaotic swirl of doubt and fear. The asylum was a place of madness, and I was starting to feel its pull. But I couldn't afford to lose myself. Not yet. I had to remain vigilant to uncover the truth behind this place. The next day, I began my rounds. The patients were a mixture of catatonic indifference and violent paranoia. Their eyes had this empty stare, like they'd witnessed things that just didn't make sense. In the midst of it all was Emily Cross, standing out distinctly from the rest. She sat in her cell, her eyes fixed on the far wall, muttering to herself. As I approached, she turned her gaze to me, and for a moment, I saw recognition. "You're the new doctor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They told me you would come." "I'm here to help, Emily. Can you tell me about the shadows?" Her eyes widened and she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. They watch us. From the corners, from the darkness. They see everything. And they speak to me. They tell me things. What things, Emily? Things that should not be, she replied, her gaze drifting back to the wall. They come from a place beyond, a place of endless dark. Her words creeped me out. I left her cell with more questions than answers. I continued my rounds, but that uneasy feeling stuck with me the whole time. Each patient had their own demons, their own horrors that seemed to repeat Emily's words. The asylum was a place of darkness, and I was only beginning to understand its depths. As the days turned into weeks, the asylum's grip on me tightened. I found myself plagued by nightmares, visions of twisted landscapes and shadowy figures that whispered in my ear. My colleagues seemed unaffected, their expressions stoic and unchanging. But I could see the cracks in their facades, the signs of strain and exhaustion. The facility's secrets were a constant weight on my mind. I spent hours poring over old records, trying to piece together the truth. But the more I uncovered, the more questions I had. What was the true purpose of Starlight Asylum? And what were the shadows that haunted Emily's every waking moment? One night, unable to sleep, I wandered the halls of the asylum. I felt a presence behind me and turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was Dr. Keller. "You shouldn't be wandering the halls at night, Dr. Sullivan." "I couldn't sleep," I replied. "This place, it's getting to me." Keller stepped closer, his gaze intense. "The asylum has a way of doing that. But you must remain strong. The patients need you." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed him. As he walked away, I felt a chill settle over me. The asylum was changing me, warping my mind. I had to find a way to resist its pull, to uncover the truth before it consumed me completely. Emily Cross had become the focal point of my routine. Her revelations, though fragmented and often nonsensical, held a disturbing consistency. I began to piece together her ramblings, hoping to understand the source of her torment. "Dr. Sullivan," Emily whispered one morning, "they come from the dark places, places where light doesn't reach. They see us as playthings." I leaned closer, trying to keep my expression neutral. "Who are they, Emily? What do they want?" Her eyes, once vacant, now gleamed with a feverish intensity. "They whisper secrets, secrets that can twist minds. They don't belong here. They come from another side, a place where things are different." "Different how?" I pressed, my pulse quickening. "Can you describe it?" Emily shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. "It's like looking into a broken mirror. Everything is wrong. They can change things, make you see things that aren't real. They want to control us, make us part of their world." Her words weren't just the product of a disturbed mind. They carried an unnerving coherence. I made a note in her file, my pen scratching the paper. As I continued my rounds, I couldn't forget Emily's words. The other patients repeated similar sentiments, each describing shadows that watched them, whispered to them. One evening, as I sat in my quarters, I reviewed the files again. Dr. Hatcher's cryptic warnings and Keller's ominous advice played over in my mind. There was a pattern here, something that connected all the patients' experiences. I just had to find it. Suddenly, a loud crash jolted me from my thoughts. I rushed out of my quarters, following the noise down the corridor. I reached the source, a storage room, its door slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. Inside, I found a disheveled nurse, her face pale and eyes wide. "Dr. Sullivan," she stammered. I heard something moving in here." I scanned the room, my eyes darting over the shelves and scattered supplies. "What did you see?" "It was like a shadow," she whispered, trembling. "But it moved on its own." My pulse quickened. "Stay here," I instructed, and stepped further into the room, my senses on high alert. Then I saw it. A figure, barely discernible, lurking in the corner. My breath caught in my throat as I approached. It moved, sliding along the wall, an amorphous mass that seemed to move in and out of existence. "Who are you?" I demanded. The figure didn't respond, but I felt a cold, invasive presence in my mind, a sensation that sent a jolt of pain through my skull. I stumbled back, disoriented. The figure dissipated, melting into the shadows as if it had never been there. The nurse rushed to my side, her face a mask of terror. "Are you okay, doctor?" "I'll be fine," I lied, steadying myself. "Go back to your duties, and don't mention this to anyone." The next morning I confronted Dr. Hatcher. She looked up as I entered her office. "Dr. Sullivan," she greeted, her tone as cold as ever. "What can I do for you?" "We need to talk," I said. "Something is very wrong here. The patients, the shadows. There's something more to this place, isn't there?" Dr. Hatcher's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that we're not just dealing with mental illness," I replied, my hands clenching into fists. "There are entities here, things that are manipulating our minds. Emily Cross, the other patients, they all described the same experiences." For a moment, a hint of emotion crossed her face. Was it fear? "Dr. Sullivan, I advise you to be careful with your accusations. This facility is highly classified, and you are here to treat patients, not investigate paranormal phenomena." "But you know, don't you?" I pressed, my voice rising. "You know what's happening here, and you're hiding it." She stood, her posture rigid. "You are treading on dangerous ground, Doctor. Focus on your duties, or you will find yourself reassigned again. This time to somewhere far less pleasant." I left her office, a knot of frustration and fear tightening in my chest. The shadows were closing in, and I felt more isolated than ever. But I couldn't stop now. I had to uncover the truth for the sake of the patients and for my own sanity. One evening, as I sat with Emily in her cell, she grabbed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "They know you're trying to understand," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "They're watching you. They're always watching." "What do they want from me, Emily?" "They want to break you," she replied. "Like they broke me. They feed on fear, on madness. They will stop at nothing to consume you." Her warning sent chills down my spine and stuck with me long after I left her cell. I knew then that I was not just fighting for the patient's sanity, I was fighting for my own. Determined to uncover the truth, I began my clandestine investigation. My first target was the archives, a repository of old records and files stored deep within the facility. It was a maze of dusty shelves and neglected paperwork. One evening, under the pretense of needing additional research for a patient's case, I ventured into the archives. The room was silent except for the soft sound of the ventilation system. I dug through stacks of files, scanning for anything that might shed light on the asylum's true purpose. I found it in a series of reports marked confidential. The files detailed a project labeled Exodus, led by Dr. Keller. The report spoke of experiments aimed at breaking down the barriers between the human mind and extra-dimensional entities. They described the use of sensory deprivation chambers, invasive neurosurgical procedures, and psychological manipulation to push patients beyond the limits of sanity. I was shaking as I read about the terrible things that were done to the patients. They were subjected to extreme conditions, their minds broken and reshaped in an attempt to harness the power of these entities. The reports mentioned visions of twisted landscapes, shadowy figures, and whispers from the darkness. Emily Cross's fragmented accounts now made a chilling sense. I snapped pictures of the documents with a small, concealed camera. If I was going to expose this, I needed evidence. As I prepared to leave, a sound behind me made me freeze. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. Dr. Keller stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Sullivan," he said, his voice cold. "What exactly are you doing here?" I quickly slipped the camera into my pocket. "I needed some old case files," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "For research." Keller's eyes narrowed. "Research, you say? And yet you seem to have stumbled upon some very sensitive material." I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. "I was just looking for patterns, something to help with the treatment." I didn't mean to overstep. He stepped closer, his presence intimidating. You need to be careful, Sullivan. Curiosity can be dangerous here. Focus on your patients and leave the past buried. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the dim light of the archives. I exhaled, the tension slowly draining from my body. I had come too close to being caught. Back in my quarters, I reviewed the photos, each one a damning piece of evidence. I needed to find a way to contact someone outside the asylum, someone who could help expose these atrocities. But the asylum's communication systems were tightly controlled, monitored by security personnel loyal to Dr. Hatcher and Keller. The next day, I returned to my routine, trying to act as though nothing had changed. Emily's sessions became more intense, her descriptions of the entities more vivid. They're hungry, she whispered one morning. They want to consume us, to use us as conduits. They need us to bridge the gap between their world and ours. Emily, how can we stop them? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. You can't. They're too powerful. But you can resist. Don't let them into your mind. They thrive on fear and despair. Her words chilled me to the bone. The more I learned, the more I realized the enormity of the threat we faced. The asylum wasn't just a place of madness. It was a battleground for control over the human mind. That night, unable to sleep, I wandered the halls again. I found myself standing outside Keller's office. The door was slightly ajar and I could hear voices inside. I listened, straining to catch their conversation. Dr. Hatcher and Keller were discussing the next phase of Project Exodus. They spoke of a new patient, a young man with no family who had been institutionalized for violent behavior. He was to be the next subject, pushed to the brink in their quest for control. I had heard enough. I backed away quietly, my head spinning. I needed to find a way to stop them, to expose their experiments before more lives were destroyed. The next day I approached Nurse Hall, the only person I thought might be sympathetic. She had always seemed uneasy about the things happening in the asylum. I found her in the infirmary, tending to a patient. Amanda, I said, my voice low, I need your help. She looked up, her eyes wary. What is it, Sullivan? I glanced around to make sure we were alone. I know about Project Exodus. They're conducting experiments on the patients, trying to harness the power of these entities. We have to stop them. Her face paled. Are you insane? If they find out you know, they'll destroy you. They'll destroy us both. I have evidence, I whispered urgently. But I need to get it to someone outside. Can you help me? She hesitated, fear and uncertainty warring on her face. Finally, she agreed. Meet me in the archives tonight. We'll find a way. That night, I waited in the archives, my nerves stretched taut. The minutes dragged by, each one heavier than the last. I checked my watch repeatedly, expecting Amanda to appear any moment. But as the hours slipped away, it became clear she wasn't coming. The next morning, I made my way to the infirmary, hoping to find some explanation for her absence. What I found instead freaked me out. Amanda lay restrained on a gurney, her eyes wide and unfocused, mouth twitching with horrors. Her once sharp features were now slack, her skin pallid and slick with sweat. What happened to her? I demanded, confronting the attending nurse. The nurse glanced at me, her expression a mix of pity and resignation. Dr. Keller said she had a psychotic break. She started screaming about shadows and beings from another world. We had to sedate her. I pushed past the nurse and approached Amanda. She didn't recognize me, her gaze drifting over my face as if I were a stranger. Amanda, I whispered, kneeling beside her. It's Sullivan. Can you hear me? Her eyes met mine, a brief moment of clarity piercing the fog. Sullivan, she stammered, her voice a raw whisper. They're here. They're inside my mind. They showed me things. What did they show you? I asked urgently, gripping her hand. Darkness, she rasped, her breath hitching. A world where the rules don't apply. They're trying to break through. They want to use us, bend us to their will. I felt a sickening twist in my gut. Dr. Keller had found out about our plan, and this was his retaliation. He had subjected Amanda to the same horrific experiments described in the Exodus files. "They can't be stopped," she continued, her voice rising in panic. "They feed on our fear, our pain. We are nothing to them, just tools, just—" Her words dissolved into incoherent babbling, her body convulsing as she was overtaken by another fit. The attending nurse moved quickly to administer another sedative, and I stepped back, helpless. I couldn't stop worrying about what would happen to Amanda and the danger Dr. Keller posed. As I moved through my duties, I kept a careful eye on his office, noting the times he was absent. I knew that if I were to find any real evidence, it would be there. The opportunity came late one night, when the lights in his office were dark and the hallway was empty. I approached the door. With a glance around to ensure no one was watching, I pulled out a small UV flashlight I had borrowed from the maintenance closet. I shined the light over the keypad, revealing the faint smudges and oils left by frequent use. 4 numbers glowed brighter than the others. I tried different combinations. On the 5th attempt, the lock beeped softly and the door clicked open. I slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind me. The office was sparse, a reflection of Keller's clinical precision. I scanned the room quickly, my eyes falling on a locked cabinet behind his desk. I needed a way to open it without drawing attention. Spotting a small keyring on Keller's desk, I hurriedly rifled through it, hoping one of the keys would fit the cabinet. I tried each key, the minutes stretching. Finally, one of the keys turned in the lock. I held my breath as I opened the cabinet, revealing files and folders neatly arranged inside. I grabbed a handful, skimming the contents. Each document was more damning than the last, detailing the horrific experiments conducted under the guise of psychiatric treatment. Patients were subjected to unspeakable torments. Isolation chambers, experimental surgeries, psychological tortures designed to push them beyond their limits. The goal was to break down the barriers between their minds and the extra-dimensional entities. But it wasn't until I found a dossier labeled Project Exodus Classified that the true horror became clear. The dossier outlined a partnership between Keller and a shadowy organization funding the experiments. The aim was to harness the power of these entities for scientific and military advancements. The documents described how they had pushed patients to the brink, using a combination of psychological manipulation, extreme sensory deprivation, and invasive neurosurgery to break down the barriers between the human mind and the entity's realm. I felt bile rise in my throat as I read about the methods. Patients screaming in padded cells, their minds shattered. Others subjected to endless darkness, their senses stripped away until they were nothing but vessels for the entities to fill. And the names. The names of patients I had seen, including Amanda. Now just entries in Keller's twisted logbook. A faint beeping sound startled me, followed by the unmistakable sound of the outer office door opening. I quickly shoved the documents back into the cabinet, locked it, and replaced the keyring on Keller's desk. I ducked behind a large filing cabinet just as Keller walked into the room. Holding my breath, I listened to his footsteps crossing the room. He sat down at his desk and started typing on his computer, oblivious to my presence. My heart raced as I waited for an opportunity to slip out unnoticed. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before he finally got up and left the office again. I emerged from my hiding place, my muscles stiff and my breath shallow. After gathering the documents, I quietly exited the office, closing the door behind me as softly as I could. I made my way back to my quarters, my head spinning from what I just discovered. I spread the documents out on my bed, taking pictures with my hidden camera. Every detail was a piece of the puzzle, each one more horrifying than the last. The next morning, the asylum felt more oppressive than ever. I avoided Keller, my mind focused on my next steps. But the feeling of dread grew when I didn't see Amanda in the infirmary. One of the nurses caught my anxious glance. "She's been transferred," the nurse said, "to the high-security ward. Dr. Keller's orders." I forced myself to stay calm. "I need to see her." The nurse hesitated, then gave a small nod. I made my way to the high-security ward. The guard at the door glanced at my ID, then let me through. Amanda's cell was at the end of the corridor. I found her sitting on the floor, her arms wrapped around her knees, rocking back and forth. She looked up as I entered, her eyes wild and unfocused. "Amanda," I whispered, kneeling beside her. "It's Sullivan. Can you hear me?" Her gaze flashed with recognition, but it was fleeting. "The shadows," she murmured, her voice hoarse. "They're inside. They showed me. They showed me." "What did they show you?" I asked, my heart aching at her broken state. "Darkness," she repeated, her voice rising in panic. "Endless darkness. They want to break us, use us. They're feeding on our fear." I gripped her hand, but she pulled away, retreating into herself. The Amanda I knew was gone, replaced by a shell, her mind shattered by Keller's experiments. In the following days, Dr. Keller's experiments accelerated. I had to do something. Desperation pushed me to make one final attempt. I decided to confront Keller directly, hoping to gather more evidence and perhaps stall his work. It was a fool's errand, but I had no other options. I approached Keller's office again, this time with less caution. My footsteps made a dull thud in the hallway as I walked up to his door. It was open, light spilling out. Voices murmured within. I crept closer, straining to hear. "Almost ready," Keller's voice, sharp and precise. "The bridge will stabilize soon. We need to ensure the subjects are prepared." A second voice, deeper and unfamiliar, responded. "The organization expects results." I dared to peek through the crack. Inside, Keller stood over a table cluttered with surgical instruments and arcane devices. Beside him was a man I had never seen before, his presence radiating authority. "Once the bridge is established, we'll have access to untold power," Keller continued. "We will transcend the limitations of our reality." I had heard enough. I backed away quietly and hurried to the patients' quarters. If I could at least warn some of them, maybe we could find a way to escape. The corridors seemed to twist and stretch, the familiar paths now alien and menacing. I reached Emily Cross's cell first. She was huddled in a corner, muttering to herself. "Emily," I whispered urgently, "we have to go, now!" She looked up, her eyes dull, but with a hint of recognition. "The shadows, they're coming!" I pulled her to her feet, and together we moved to gather as many patients as we could. Some were too far gone, their minds shattered beyond repair. But others, like Emily, had enough presence of mind to follow. As we made our way to the lower levels where the escape pods were located, an alarm sounded, and the asylum was plunged into chaos. Guards were mobilized, but their attention was divided. The experiment was beginning. We reached the observation deck just in time to witness the horror unfold. Through the reinforced glass, we saw the central room bathed in light. Keller and his team worked around a massive machine. Suddenly, the air seemed to warp, and a tear appeared in the fabric of reality. The extra-dimensional entities poured through, their forms shifting and amorphous. Screams erupted as the entities descended upon the facility. They tore through metal and flesh with equal ease, consuming everything in their path. Keller's triumph turned to horror as he realized the magnitude of his mistake, but it was too late. "Run!" I shouted, pushing Emily and the others ahead of me. "Get to the pods!" We raced down the corridors, the sounds of destruction and death around us. One by one, we loaded the patients into the pods, sealing them in and launching them away from the nightmare that had consumed the asylum. I was the last to board, slamming the hatch shut just as an entity surged towards me, its form a mass of darkness. I activated the pod's launch sequence, the thrusters firing as the entity slammed into the glass. The pod shot away from the station, and I watched through the viewport as Starlight Asylum was swallowed by chaos. As the stars blurred into streaks of light, I activated the distress beacon and began broadcasting an SOS. "This is Dr. Sullivan from Starlight Asylum. The facility has been overrun by extra-dimensional entities. Do not approach. I repeat, do not approach." The project must be stopped at all costs. We are facing an invasion. I slumped in the seat, exhaustion washing over me. I was alive, and I had to hope that my message would reach someone, anyone, who could help stop this nightmare from spreading. The escape pod drifted through the void, its trajectory taking it far from the doomed Starlight Asylum. Inside, I monitored the distress signal, hoping it would reach someone who could make a difference. Eventually, a response came. A deep space rescue vessel intercepted the pod. They pulled me aboard, their faces a mix of curiosity and suspicion. I handed over the data I had collected, the evidence of Keller's twisted experiments, the horrors that had unfolded. They promised to investigate, to bring the truth to light. Days passed in debriefings and medical examinations. The crew treated me with a cautious respect, aware of the fragile state of my mind. I shared everything: Amanda's fate, the experiments, the entities. My words felt inadequate, the true horror of what I had witnessed impossible to convey. Eventually, I was given a small room, a semblance of privacy. I spent my time documenting everything, creating a detailed record of the events leading up to the disaster. The act of writing was cathartic, a way to purge the memories that haunted me. One day, as I sat at the small desk, the door opened, and a senior officer entered. She handed me a report, the official findings of the investigation. Starlight Asylum was now classified as a quarantine zone, the breach contained but not eradicated. The entities were real, and efforts were underway to understand and combat them. There was a sense of validation in reading the report. My warnings had been heeded, and steps were being taken to prevent further incursions. The crew had arranged for me to be transferred to a secure facility, a place where I could recover and contribute to the ongoing research. I accepted, knowing that my knowledge was valuable, that my experiences could help prevent another catastrophe. The fight against the extra-dimensional entities had begun, and I was ready to face it.